Righty-ho, I think we might start actually, since we're now 1837. So great. So again, thanks everybody for turning out tonight to celebrate the launch of From Spare Oom to War Drobe. It's great that you can all join us on Friday night. For the people that I've just admitted, my name's Will. I'm representing Darton Longman Pod this evening, and we are the publisher of Catherine's new book. The format tonight will be as follows. I'll do a short introduction, which this is the beginning, and that will include a few house rules to follow. Then I'll hand over to author and journalist Amanda Craig, who's going to interview Catherine. That will form the main part of the launch. And lastly, as aforementioned, there'll be the chance to put your own question to Catherine. And to do that, you can use the chat function. As said, I will find them and ask them of Catherine at the end. As I've already said to a few of the people who have already been here for a little while, please make sure your audio is muted on Zoom as the event proceeds. I should point out at this juncture that the event's also being recorded too, so if you don't wish to be filmed, please switch your camera off using the Zoom function. The video of the launch will be put up on YouTube next week, an edited version of that. So just to make you aware, we're on speaker view anyway, so it's unlikely to be seen, but just to make you aware, that's what we're doing if you don't want to be filmed. And as said, if you want to ask a question of Catherine, use the chat function, and I will post in the chat function once I've finished, just to demonstrate how it works, and we can go from there. So, moving on, here we go. From Spare Oom to War Drobe, travels in Narnia with my 9-year-old self. I've got a copy of the hardback here. And we're very proud to publish Catherine's latest book. What can I say about it? Generally speaking, for me, it's often both enjoyable and inspiring to be in the company of someone who has a deep knowledge and interest in any given subject. And not only does it give you a great appreciation of the topic at hand, but also opens doors in your mind that pave the way potentially for new discoveries of your own. As I said, at least it's certainly always been the case for me. And when hearing from or reading something by an expert on an aspect of our culture, whether it be music, film, or in this case, a book, and more specifically in this case, obviously C.S. Lewis's Narnia tales. Catherine's knowledge and understanding of Narnia is really quite remarkable, and I can't really put it better than to quote Neil Gaiman, who said after reading this very book, those of us who have visited Narnia through the book, often that we could recite our favourite moments and sentences, might not think that there is anything new waiting for us. In the role of a knowledgeable and enthusiastic guide, Katherine Langrish takes us to a place we thought we knew and makes it finer and more interesting than it was before. And I think that's a great testament to what Catherine's written, and I fully endorse that. Also, it's Catherine's knowledge, understanding and passion for Narnia that, as Brian Sibley alludes to in his foreword, will, I think, help inspire the next generation of what Brian terms a nose in the book, I'm lost to the world child. And as a parent myself, if there's a tone that helps me communicate the power of the Narnia stories with my own kids, and or in turn encourage them to read the Seven Chronicles or simply read books, especially in the skittish world of smart technology, Zoom included, then I fully endorse that too. Before I just hand over to Amanda, just to reiterate, From Spare Oom to War Drobe is available now in hardback and from all good bookstores, and an ebook. And as I said, there are signed copies available, which I will let you know how to get your hands on in the chat and later. But I think that's quite enough from me for now, and I'm sure you'll be wanting to hear from Catherine. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to author and journalist Amanda Craig, who's going to interview Catherine about From Spare Oom to War Drobe.
Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to readers, welcome to writers, and welcome, dare I say it, to Narnians or would-be Narnians. About 50 years ago, the author Katherine Langrish was a little 9-year-old girl, And like a lot of us, she was so obsessed with Narnia that she was convinced that it had to exist. Sadly, she never found her way into it, although she later became an author herself of some excellent children's books. But she longed for C.S. Lewis to write some more of these books, but there were only 7 and he died 3 years earlier, so she knew there weren't going to be any more. And like a number of superfans, Katherine solved this problem, or tried to solve it, by writing an 86-page fan fiction, although the term hadn't then been invented, story of her own about King Gale, who's a character very briefly mentioned in one of the Narnia books, and discovered, or began to discover, some of the pains of being an actual writer rather than a reader. However, she began to think more and more about these stories, and she realized, even as a child, that there was a qualitative difference between her enjoyment of Enid Blyton's stories and those of the Narnia books. So I'm just going to ask Katherine to begin by telling us what it was that she really loved about Narnia. What was it that made it completely unique in her experience as a child reader?
I think it was the scene setting, if that's not too sort of dry a way of putting it. It was the world, really. It was the way he wrote about the world. It was the vivid quality of the black sky of Charn with the red sun sort of setting over it. It was, at the end of the last battle, it was the stars falling like exploding silver fireworks and coming down around the children as they stand by the doorway of the stable. It was that wonderful gallop that Aslan takes across the countryside with the children on his back, with Lucy and Susan on his back after he's come back to life from the stone table. I mean, I just really, really desired to be there. And of course, it's particularly that gallop across the countryside is a sort of English countryside that's been transformed into something even better than it is. You know, I think it's something like acres of bluebells and spring woods bursting with blossom, and up sort of blue mountains and down dales, and, you know, Aslan going at top speed with the children clinging to his back. It wasn't the story. It was the story was very important to me, of course, but this conjuration of this amazing world, which seemed so real, that I really desperately wanted to get into it. That's and the moors in the wild moors in the Silver Chair, which was the first.
It's somehow a very physical experience, isn't it, as well as an emotional one. And what's fantastic about your book, which I'm sure you've all had a look at the jacket now, is that you see Narnia and the Narnia books with a kind of double vision, because you seem to have perfect recall of what you felt and thought as a 9-year-old, but you also interrogate it as an adult in a very knowledgeable, scholarly, funny and affectionate way. And I think that's one of the things that makes this book so unique. I have read one other very good book by Laura Miller, the American essayist, called The Magician's Book, about her own quest for Narnia, which is very good, but totally different from this. And I think what gives it its huge enjoyability is your deep knowledge of literature and fairy tales, which we'll get onto. But C.S. Lewis himself believed that books were like doors into other worlds. And you've got a passage very early on about where he gets this apprehension from and how important old houses were to him. You go quite deep into his childhood. And I wonder, it would, for people who haven't read this book yet, if it would help if you would just read a little passage of how you go into him.
Sure. Well, this would be a passage from close to the end of the introduction. While I was considering the Narnia books as a whole, instead of just book by book, I began to realize that there was an imagery of rambling, labyrinthine old houses that runs right through all 7 of the books, and also appears in other publications by Lewis. So I'll read this short passage. At the beginning of The Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan explains how he came to write the book. While engaged upon a different work about the spiritual life, Bunyan fell into an allegory and saw how he could represent it as the physical journey of the saints to glory. Ideas began to multiply in his head like sparks that from the coals of fire did fly. Now, in an essay on Bunyan, Lewis suggests that in this coalescence of adventurous quest and spiritual journey, we can see Bunyan's earnest Christianity coming together with his boyhood delight in old wives' tales and chivalric romances. The one fitted the other like a glove, he remarks. Now, as never before, the whole man was engaged. Now, as never before, the whole man was engaged. Lewis might be talking about himself. The Narnia books are a fusion of his lifelong love of literature, his Christian faith, and the experiences of his own childhood, the latter most obviously in The Magician's Nephew, where Diggory's wish to save his sick mother derives its poignancy from the death of Lewis's own mother in his early boyhood. But there's more to it than that. In The Lion, the Witch and the War Drobe, the professor's big house full of book rooms and passages and unexpected places sounds a lot like Lewis's childhood home, Leaborough House, or Little Lee, a big house on the outskirts of Belfast, to which his family moved in 1905 when he was just 7 and before his mother fell ill. In Surprised by Joy, he describes it with love. The new house is almost a major character in my story. I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles, also of endless books. Well, the new house is a major character in Lewis's stories because this imagery of labyrinthine houses, passages, secret rooms and doorways into elsewhere recurs throughout the Narnia series. Here are some examples: the Victorian attics of The Magician's Nephew and the palace city of Charn, the professor's house and the wardrobe itself in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which contains the whole world of Narnia. There's Aravis and her friend Lazareline losing themselves in the dangerous maze of the old palace of Tashbarn, and the Pevensey children exploring the ruins of Cair Paravel in Prince Caspian and discovering the treasure chamber. There's Lucy tiptoeing along the creepy sunlit passages of the magician's house in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There's the city ruinous and the dark castle of Underland and the Silver Chair, and the stable in The Last Battle, which is arguably the last and greatest doorway of all. And not coincidentally, I think the triumphant cry from the end of The Last Battle, farther up and further in, is consciously or unconsciously borrowed from George MacDonald's adult fantasy Lilith, another book set in a vast rambling house with portals to other dimensions.
Pretty.
In chapter 5, the protagonist, Mr. Vane, rushes after the figure of a mysterious Mr. Raven, chasing him up many stairs into unfamiliar attic regions and a garret furnished only with a mirror. Vane stumbles through the frame into a wild visionary landscape and is told by Mr. Raven that he has come into this strange land through a door. I never saw any door, I persisted. Of course not, he returned. All the doors you had yet seen, and you haven't seen many, were doors in. Here you came upon a door out. The strange thing to you, he went on thoughtfully, will be that the more doors you go out of, the further you get in. So the more doors you go out of, the further you go in, is almost certainly what Lewis also means us to understand, an exit from the narrowness of selfhood, which paradoxically leads to an expansion and enrichment of apprehension. This imagery of an endless house isn't restricted to Narnia. It comes from somewhere deep, turning up in Lewis's Christian apologetics as well, and even in his literary criticism. In my father's house there are many rooms, said Jesus, and in the preface to Mere Christianity, Lewis describes the basic Christian faith as a hallway out of which doors open into different rooms representing different denominations. The hall, he said, is a place to wait, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. In its function, this hall sounds surprisingly like the wood between the worlds, another in-between place that opens into many dimensions, a place of potential, not a place to stay. In his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung recorded a personal dream of exploring an ancient house. It began somewhere on an upper floor in a richly furnished salon hung with fine old pictures. Going downstairs, he found a ground floor furnished in older medieval style. Exploring room after room, he came across a heavy old door and behind it a stone staircase leading further down into an even older vaulted room with a trapdoor in the floor, and below that, a cave containing 2 ancient skulls. Jung's interpretation of the dream was that the house was a kind of image of the psyche, and that his descent through the various levels was a descent from the conscious mind into the unconscious. And from this reading, he came to form his theories of the collective unconscious and of archetypes or symbols common to the human mind. Lewis acknowledged the emotional and poetic power of Jung's theory of archetypes. Writing with a touch of humour, he commented that even if it turned out to be poor science, it was still excellent poetry of a mythic character. The concept of the archetype as something old, meaningful, hidden, deeply buried, but gradually coming to light, made him feel like Schliemann digging up what he believed to be the very bones of Agamemnon, king of men. Or my own self, hoping as a child for that forgotten, that undiscovered room. Maybe most children hope to find a hidden room. Still, in expressing this desire, here is Lewis returning to the same potent image. And perhaps there's a chance for me to speculate that for Lewis, the archetypal house symbolized the security of his childhood before his mother's death. After that event, little Lee became gradually intolerable to him. While his father was dying, he described it in a letter as a place where he had never experienced freedom. Yet he added, I have never been able to resist the retrogressive influence of this house, which always plunges me back into the pleasures and pains of a boy. So the house which sheltered the happiness of Lewis's early childhood had long vanished into that land of lost content, the far country of the past. But in imagination, he was a constant visitor, exploring passages and tiptoeing into rooms, searching for the doorway through which he might pass into joy.
It's wonderful, isn't it? I think that perhaps that is one of the reasons, or maybe the deepest reasons, why Lewis's Narnia books affect us so much. Why we can't quite rid ourselves of the illusion that they really must exist. And it is very fascinating to think about all the what you call the thick forest of allusions that he was drawing on as an academic and a reader, which you go into most beautifully. I began to read some of your essays about the Narnia books in your extraordinary blog, 7 Miles of Steel Thistles, which is usually more concerned with folk tales, isn't it, and myth. And I realized that you were not only a wonderful writer of children's books yourself, but you were very scholarly and had an extraordinary grasp of these stories. And gradually I began to see more and more essays on Narnia. Just to sort of blow my own trumpet, I was the one who encouraged you to turn these into a book. And not to self-publish it, but to have it published by a proper publisher, which I'm absolutely thrilled it now is. To give, for people who haven't seen this book yet, its beauty is not just in the words, but this is an extract from Catherine's story about the Narnian King Gale, which has been reproduced in her very good 9-year-old's handwriting, full of little phrases that we may recognize, lots of sires and these and thous. It's absolutely charming. But you go through each of the books in turn, not in the order that Lewis himself wrote them, but in the order that you might call is chronological, from The Magician's Nephew, about the creation of Narnia, right through to the last battle. And as you go through them, you present us not just with the storyline, but with quite astonishing insights into how Lewis is writing, what he is alluding to, your own thoughts as an adult and your thoughts as a child reader. How did you come about this technique? Because it's very unusual. It's sort of academic close reading, but also you are yourself engaging with these stories at a very deep imaginative level.
I think it's because when I went back to look at these books, when, as you say, I started writing the blogs, it had occurred to me that I hadn't read the Narnia books for a very long time, and yet they'd meant huge amounts to me as a child. I tried them on my own daughters, who sort of enjoyed them but weren't particularly impressed. They were into Harry Potter, and that was fine. So probably a good 20 years had passed, and I thought, well, they meant a lot to me. I think they still do, but I wonder what will happen if I go back. And what really happened was that all those memories of my childhood reading were so strong that it really almost felt like a collaboration. And I felt as though this little girl who used to be me was there in my head, popping up with comments, because I could remember so very clearly how I felt about the books, and even in certain circumstances where I was the first time I read them. I mean, the first time I read them all out of order. So the first one was given me by my mother, I think the Christmas I was 8, and that was The Silver Chair. I don't think she realised that it was one of a series. And the last one I ever read was the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which I had to wait for about 18 months before I came to it. And my younger brother had been taken off to hospital with peritonitis after having swallowed a cocktail stick that he and his friends had been blowing at each other out of drinking straws at a children's party. So my poor little brother was languishing in hospital, and I was sort of being left alone in the house, feeling rather miffed, because my brother was getting all these toys and presents and books and colouring things, and I wasn't getting anything. And really, I think to shut me up, my mother and my father, it was probably my mother, went out and bought the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and we had this great big armchair with sort of bristly upholstery, and I curled up in it, and I could just lost myself in this amazing world of sky and sea and, almost heavenly light. And it was one of the most ecstatic moments of my life, I think. Poor little brother was having a rotten time in hospital, but I was really enjoying myself. So this child's view, I didn't have to mind for it. She just kept popping up with her own opinions, and we needed to sort of have a conversation, so we did.
And it's such an interesting conversation because, for at least half my life, C.S. Lewis has been very much attacked as racist, sexist, and a proselytizer for the Christian religion. And you address these in the course of examining each book in turn in a terrifically bracing and yet sensitive way. You come to several conclusions that were very pleasing to me, let us say. So, for instance, can you talk a little bit about how you think he depicts his heroines? Because in the received opinion from particularly people like Philip Pullman, who I do adore but feel is severely wrong about Narnia, is that Lewis was saying that death is better than life and boys are better than girls and all sorts of things, and you take apart this. It was a newspaper piece, but
yes, it was a long time ago as well. I think it was 1998, and I don't know whether he's modified his views since then. I suspect he may have a little, but I haven't spoken to him because I don't know him. Or we met a couple of times. I mean, his views are really worth considering. I would never dismiss them out of hand. the charge of misogyny or sexism, I think I just don't go along with, because I was this little girl reading the Narnia stories. And as I say in the book, most of the books that I was reading in the 1960s, you could tell very, very frequently, unless they were actually girls' stories about girls' schools or ballet or something like that, generally speaking, the author was assuming that the reader was a boy. It just came over that way. So, and there were all these slurs thrown at girls in the fiction of the time, like cry like a girl, behave like a girl, you know, run like a girl, don't be such a girl. And it wasn't something that we really noticed. We did notice it, but it was internalized. And I think the way I certainly got around this, and probably a number of other children of my generation, was to just behave as though, read as though we were boys.
Yeah, I remember that.
It's not aimed at me because I'm not like that, so I'm this boy that I'm reading this book. But Lewis didn't do that. He just did not do that. He has these amazing heroines. Lucy, for example, he absolutely, you can tell he really loves her. She's this shiningly good character, and not goody-goody, because she gets things wrong and she does bad things occasionally. She can be temperamental, she can stamp her foot and fall out with her sister. She nearly goes off the rails in the magician's house in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because she's going through this wonderful magician's book and she comes across a spell to make beautiful her that uttereth it beyond the loss of mortals, and she's really tempted. And of course the magician's book, the magician being a magician is this ambiguous figure. He's a sort of Prospero. He's not a bad magician, but I think Lewis is saying that magic isn't always, it's a tool. It depends on how you use it as to whether it's bad magic or good magic. And he's this ambiguous figure. So the book is ambiguous. So it's tempting her, and it shows her pictures of her older sister Susan, who's the beauty of the family, coming home and being frightfully jealous because Lucy's got this amazing beauty, which is going to cause her to be like another Helen. And she almost does it. And that's Lucy doing something really quite bad.
Yeah.
But she still doesn't, she gets ticked off by Aslan, but in a very, very nice way. So there's Lucy, who's really has immense integrity and is very brave and courageous, and I loved her. I also love Jill, who's extremely practical. She's the heroine of the last two books, The Silver Chair and the Last Battle. She's this wonderful scout. She can find her way through the Narnian woods as well as a dryad. She's the one who thinks of breaking into the stables to find out what's really in there and releases the false Aslan, the little donkey puzzle. So she's got tremendous courage and determination. There's Aravis, who's this glamorous, noble woman or noble girl who's escaping from a forced marriage with, dressing up in her brother's armor, riding a horse, wielding a sword. What was not to like? The girls they're more interesting than the boys, actually, I think. Apart from Eustace. Eustace is very interesting.
Yeah.
And I've got a suspicion, which I didn't think of when I was writing the book, and I wish now I'd thought of it in time and I would have put it in, is that we all know that Diggory is C.S. Lewis, this little boy who's losing his mother. But I've suddenly got this strong suspicion that Eustace is also Lewis, because he's this know-it-all who knows what assonance is, and is obviously being bullied at school and isn't popular. And we know that Lewis had a bad time at school. And Lewis really sets up Eustace at the beginning of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. We're directed to dislike him from the very opening sentence. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And he behaves in a way that as a child, I just thought, well, what a horrible boy. But now I think, well, actually, the Pevenses are really not being nice to him. They're not talking to him. They're not letting him in on anything. He comes and sort of hangs around the door and provokes them by coming up with a limerick. I think it begins, some kids that played games about Narnia grew gradually balmier and balmier. And Edmund says, I think Lucy says it doesn't rhyme. And Eustace says it's an assonance. And Edmund says, don't ask him what an assonance is, he's only dying to be asked, say nothing and perhaps he'll go away. And this is really horrible if you think about it from an adult point of view. And I just wonder whether that's not Lewis too.
Well, of course, Catherine, you know, all characters that live in fiction are aspects of the author, as we both know.
Yeah.
Lewis is enormously interesting on so many subjects, but one of them is definitely childhood itself, isn't it? I mean, you go into how he encourages a child reader to think. You know, he doesn't talk down. I almost said to us, to them. And yet there are things about his idea of the ideal fairyland world of Narnia that are quite troubling. I mean, he's very against science. He's very against schools themselves. You know, if you think about one of the climactic scenes in Prince Caspian, in which a school is made to fall down by the Bacchae, and you know, there are times when you feel that proselytizing, not in the Christian sense, but in the sense that he's against progress of any kind.
Yeah.
And it is somewhat troubling to have that. You know, there is a bit of you, I think, even as a child, that knows that you can't totally escape school and live free in the wild north. What do you think? Do you think that the philosophical and moral questions that he was encouraging children to ponder, they were certainly very original? Do you think they were beneficial to specifically to you? I mean, there is an aspect of English children's literature which has a kind of dark side as well, doesn't it?
Yes, I don't think, because Narnia struck me as a fairy tale world when I was a child. And in a fairy tale, most fairy tales are, most traditional, well, obviously nearly all traditional fairy tales are pre-industrial. You don't get towns or railways in traditional fairy tales. And so it's a world which is a perfect world for a child, because you don't go to school, and children generally don't like going to school. You know, you want the holidays to come. You expect, actually this year probably the children do want to go to school, and they found out what it's like not to be able to go to school. But the idea that there would be a place where you could live a perfect life with lots of wonderful talking animals, and the sun would always be shining, and there'd be no restrictions placed on you at all. And of course, it's also a world in which children rule. The Pevensey children become the kings and queens of Narnia. And although they grow up very rapidly towards the end, right at the very end of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and appear as adults briefly in The Horse and His Boy, it's always about children. It's the children who are doing the good things in that world. So I think I realised that was fantasy, and I don't think it did me any harm. But I've slightly forgotten where we were going here. It's there is things to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is what's famously been called, I think, by Neil Gaiman, the problem of Susan.
Ah, yes.
That you know, the girl who is condemned never to go to Narnia at the end because she likes makeup and stockings and possibly boys. You know, he is drawing up.
That was very naughty of him, I think.
No, it was very naughty, and it is this prelapsarian idea that, you know, the moment which is very strong in all classic children's fiction, I may add, that, you know, you can only have admittance to fairyland if you not just don't have sex, but don't really think about sex. You know, the moment you do that, you're doomed. There's very interesting divisions between American children's literature and British, I think, as well in that respect. But racism, you know, which is the other charge that's leveled at him, you do agree that he is racist
Yes,
although you describe Prince Caspian as quite interestingly nuanced on that. Can
yeah,
you go into the two?
That's an interesting book. It was never my favourite as a child, but it's very interesting. Just to start off with the obvious racism in the depiction of the Calamans. And the very first time we come across them is in the Lone Islands in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which I think it might have been written, I think it was written before The Horse and His Boy, or it was drafted before The Horse and His Boy. And so the very, very first time he's writing, or we come across the Calamans, they are slavers. And he describes them, I think, as cultured but cruel. Anyway, he uses that word cruel. Wise, ancient, courteous and cruel, which does away with the value of any of the other epithets. And yet it's interesting because we're invited there to see these brown-skinned people with turbans in an obviously different culture from that of the Narnians as the wicked slavers. And yet the Lone Islanders are involved with this. They have a slave market in their harbour town, and they're being run by a governor, whom of course in the end Caspian overthrows and replaces with a duke, on the grounds presumably that a duke is going to be a good ruler and a governor is never going to be a good ruler. But it's almost as though we're being, the white people are being excused. And when you look historically at the history of slavery, obviously white people have been heavily involved, have been imprisoning and enslaving brown-skinned people. So to sort of put all the weight of that onto the Calamans in such a tiny chapter, I think is a bit telling. And then towards the end of it's in the middle of the last battle when I think it's Tyrion and Jill will come across the Calaman soldiers who are enslaving the talking horses. Again, it's all about slavery. They're a country that is represented as entirely corrupt. It's a corrupt system, and yet it's a system which is clearly a state in the way that Narnia isn't. They have a ruler, they have cities, they have roads, they have a class system, and there's no magic. Absolutely no magic in Calaman. I think it's very striking, and that's not something I noticed when I was a child. It took me rereading it to see this, that this culture that's apparently based on the Arabian Nights, it's got no magic at all, no flying carpets, no griffins, no peris, nothing like that. It's devoid of magic. And the same thing happens when you look at the Telmarine culture. In fact, all the male baddies in the Narnia stories from Edmund on have these fantasies of mechanization. From Edmund, who's thinking about where the principal railways will run, as he's trekking off to the White Witch's castle in the Land of Witch and War Drobe, right the way through to Shift the Ape in the last battle. They're coming up with industrialization, effectively. And it's considerably more obvious than it is in The Lord of the Rings. But I think he and Tolkien shared a similar feeling about, we don't want mechanization, we don't want mills, we don't want chimneys. That's all down to sort of Saruman and Sauron. What we want is the Shire and this idyllic English countryside with its sort of magical dimension that we don't really have. But no, I think the Calamans are definitely racist, and I think he was very unfair to them. And there's this ghastly bit when the Calaman soldiers are rushing to arrest Tyrion, who's just killed a couple of them. And I think it says their eyes were flashing terribly against their brown skin, and they smell of onion and garlic. And you can't get much more dog whistle than that. It's absolutely inexcusable. And he should have known better. He should have known better.
Well, he should, but it is awfully easy to judge writers from other eras, perhaps less enlightened than our own, who can say by our own standards. Yes, I mean you do recoil as an adult reader coming across that. I can see Francis Spufford among other people in the audience. He's one of the people who also wrote a fan fiction novel, which sadly most of us were not allowed to read because of the C.S. Lewis estate, called The Stone Table. But it is remarkable how his vision, his imagination has continued to enthrall children. I mean, I know Harry Potter seems as if it's overtaken Narnia. I wonder if it's just that it's had better film adaptation. But you go into things in so much delightful detail. It's hard to pick out, you know, just one significant point. But you do say at the end that C.S. Lewis basically shaped your whole life. You know, he made you into a writer and a reader, and kind of got you an education, encouraged you to self-educate yourself. I feel the same way about him. And I wonder if we can now take some questions from the audience, because I'm sure this is not a unique feeling. I think, William, you were going to read out some of the questions.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Amanda. We've got a fair few that have come in on the chat in the last few moments. I might actually start, I'll start with Vineet actually, and we were talking about the Calamen just now, and racism, and Vineet says, growing up as an Asian child in Scotland, I was always conscious of the Calamen as somehow reflecting negatively a dimension of my race and identity, but never thought any deeper about their portrayal. Only now in adult life do I, even as a loyal Narnian, feel slightly troubled about how they are seen. I'd like to know how we present the Narnian books to BA, ME children nowadays. How do we frame them? And that's...
Well, I'm probably not the right person to ask, because sadly I don't know any BA, children. But although some years ago I was chatting to a group of Muslim girls at a local school, but they were teenagers, and we were talking about fantasy writing, and the Narnia books turned up. The one thing that struck me there was that they'd never spotted the Christian symbolism in the books at all. It came as a complete surprise to them, and I'm not surprised, because I think unless the adults in your life are determined to explain it to you, you're unlikely to spot that as a child, perhaps until you get to the last battle. By the way, excuse me, I'm having trouble with sunlight coming in and sort of making, I'm just going to try and rearrange a screen. Maybe that helps, I'm not sure. Never mind. But I think probably the best thing to do is just to be completely honest about it. And I mean, there was, I've had, when I was talking about having conversations about this on Twitter, a number of people of Asian heritage were talking to me about this, and a number of them did say, I'm afraid I can't remember everybody's names, but a number of people did say that they had been troubled by this, or had felt that they were in love with the books until they got to The Horseman's Boy and then felt very disappointed. But it's obvious, isn't it? And not something we can ignore. So either you skip those books or you read through them with children of this age. Are you thinking perhaps in school situations where you're reading to a class and you've got a mixed class? I think the only thing to do is to sort of actually discuss it before you start the book and say, look, this was written a long time ago. It's a lovely book in many respects, but there are going to be some passages which we wouldn't approve of now, and I don't think you got it right. And let's see who can spot the bad passages, which is your time, and then open a discussion about it. There was certainly one parent that was in touch with me on Twitter who said that he and his wife are using the books as a jump-off point for discussions, because he said it's better to challenge bigotry when you do come across it, than to ignore it. And so, you know, that would perhaps be my way of going through it, because with all their faults, and they do have faults, the books are still immensely rich. And I don't think even the who said that they felt so disappointed by this reaction, you know, by their reaction to The Horseman's Boy, where really all the Calamans, there's only, I mean, Aravis is a Calaman, Emeth in the last battle is a Calaman, and then there's Lazareline, the rather sort of ditzy friend of Aravis in the Horseman's Boy, who actually does pretty well, I think. But all the rest of them are corrupt or fat or sort of evil or bad or slaves or dressed drably, and it's a sad process, it's a sad progress getting through the streets of Tashbaan, where only the Narnians appear to be free and frank, which is, I think he calls them frank, and that's a telling word from the roots of Western civilization. So there's definitely problems there.
I suppose just continuing this theme briefly, there's a bunch of other questions, I'm just kind of throwing them together. Linda Newbury asks, was there therefore ever a time growing up when you became disenchanted with the Narnia Chronicles? And Matthew Tobin mentions whether the allegorical aspects of the stories, when they were revealed to you, whether that influenced, marred potentially your feelings about the books. And Celia Rees also is wondering about Lewis's portrayal of the White Witch and attitudes to how that might sort of highlight, underline his attitudes towards adult women as well.
Okay, well, yeah, gosh. So sorry, I forgot the first question.
So the first one was, when you were growing up, was there ever a time you became disenchanted with Narnia? And I suppose might have been, if there was, might it have been because of some of the allegorical aspects of the story, or indeed?
No, well, I can answer that one very, very easily, because the answer is no, I never became disenchanted with her. And part of the reason for going back to do this rereading and investigation as a child, as an adult rather, was to find out whether the guilt would have worn off the gingerbread, and it really hadn't. The allegorical aspect I spotted when I got to the end of the last battle, because the allegory then becomes explicit. And in fact, the books aren't allegories. They aren't. They are retellings of the Passion of Christ, for example, in The Lion, the Witch and the War Drobe, in much the same way as his book Perelandra, which is the second of his science fiction trilogy, is a retelling of the temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. You've got the Green Lady on the massive, wonderful oceans of Perelandra, which is Venus, with these rafts of weed upon which she floats, and a devil figure coming in from our world, which is unfortunately one of the scientists, trying to turn her away from God. I've forgotten what God is called in that world.
Maladil.
Yes, Maladil, thank you. Or Maladil, yeah. And so she's not Eve, but she's in an Eve situation. And for me, Aslan isn't Christ, he's in a Christ situation. And I think that's where Lewis started from. But I think he contradicts himself quite a bit, because he ended up getting an awful lot of letters from an awful lot of people saying, you know, is Aslan Christ? And sometimes he said it was, and sometimes he said, well, no, not really, this is a retelling. So you can kind of think what you like about that.
So
but
just
sorry.
Keep going. Sorry, I was just going to...
Well, I was going to say that at the very end of the last battle, he pulls away the curtain and all the lights go up in the amphitheatre, and suddenly you're not in the play anymore, you're outside the play. And I think it's a mistake. I was very disappointed when I got to the end of the last battle, because Aslan didn't look like a lion anymore. And even though we met a lot of old friends, once they got up into back up into Aslan's holy mountain, it was very confusing. And then it's joined up to England, and that was the last thing I wanted. I read the books to get away from England, not have England suddenly connected to Narnia in this strange way. And I didn't really read the last battle very often, and you can tell that by the much better condition of that Penguin copy. All the others got read to bits and in some cases replaced, but the last battle remained in fairly good nick. The White Witch. I'm assuming, is this the question from Celia? This is about sort of what is Lewis's attitude to adult women, perhaps. Certainly, I think his little girls he's fine with. I think there could be an argument that he's afraid of adult women, or that he finds them difficult to deal with. Certainly, perhaps before he met Joy. But on the other hand, I think the female villains in his book are very, very charismatic. I mean, wouldn't you rather be the White Witch or Queen Jadis or the Green Lady than Shifty Ape or Uncle Andrew, who are just as evil, but nothing like so glamorous? So, Yeah, I mean, there's this thing about, well, I think somebody put something interesting on Twitter the other day about, I seem to have got a strange, I've dug down here, I'm getting weird war paint of light. I've got the setting sun is coming through the window at me. I'll try that, that's better. Somebody was talking about, and I don't remember who it was, somebody was talking about lipstick being used even by women writers. If you've got a female character in a book with lipstick and high heels, they're usually a vampire. And I thought, ooh, that may be true, actually. And of course, the White Witch certainly has this sugar white face with scarlet lips, so she's definitely a vamp. And the Green Lady, whom has sometimes been thought to be another emanation of the White Witch, but I've always felt she was a different personality. She's very coquettish and sort of feminine.
Didn't she come out of some terrible row he had with a female Don about Christianity? I think I remember reading in a biography that he tried to kind of bluster, and she just coolly dismantled him in public, and he was really upset by this.
Yeah, but there was a female theologian whom he got against in one of the colleges, and of course he wasn't really a theologian himself. He was a popular theologian, which isn't saying something at all. And I believe she wiped the floor with him. But I've never been quite sure whether that was true, that she sort of he turned her into the Green Lady, because Green Lady is effectively straight out of medieval romances.
Absolutely.
And she's pretty ace. So you know, if this Don was being turned into the Green Lady, I would take it as a compliment personally. And she very nearly persuades them all that Plato's theory of the cave can be turned on its head, and there really is no reality outside the literal cave. So she does pretty well before she turns into a serpent and is hacked to pieces.
Yeah.
Great. Question here from Francis Spafford. When I was fully immersed in Narnia as a child, I wasn't aware at all that it was a world made of words. It was made of sensations as far as I was concerned. Was it the same for you at 9, or were you savouring the words by then?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I think I was aware of the words. And the music of the words, because one of the things I always loved about Lewis is his narrative voice, which is so strong and so easily recognizable that once I'd finished reading all the Narnia books and was growing old enough to read other stuff by Lewis, and my parents had a number of his theological works on the shelves. They had the Screwtape Letters, which was of course quite accessible, and they had the Problem of Pain, and they had Miracles. And it was like, C.S. Lewis, I'm going to read this. And I read it. And I may not have sort of totally understood everything. I was probably about 14 by this point, but I just enjoyed his voice. And so I think I migrated from there. I realized that he'd written a book called The Allegory of Love. So I ordered this from the local bookshop, and I was probably about 16, and plowed my way through The Allegory of Love with great interest, despite having not read a single one of the texts it mentioned. So again, because I really loved his voice. So I think, Francis, to be honest with you, the music of the words and the writing sort of definitely hit home. Of course, they did conjure up these amazing images as well. So it was quite a full-on sensation being in Narnia. It did feel as though you were really there, for sure.
Just and one that kind of a question from Brian Sidby that sort of follows up in one sense. How important were Pauline Baines's illustrations to your youthful reading? They were and still are inseparable. Massively, massively.
There can't be any other illustrator of Narnia in my book. She just nailed it. She's wonderful. They are Narnia, and I mean, I was copying them all. I mean, this is my little book. I don't know if you can see that, but that's the Lone Islands copied out.
Yeah.
And somewhere here, I think, oh yes, no, that was my own illustration, because I was into horses. That's my Queen Camilla riding a horse. And then I think we've got a rather nice dragon somewhere. That'll be King Gale, won't it? Yes, there we go. That's Eustace as a dragon, which I copied because I needed a dragon. But then I put lots of little people running away from the dragon, because this is the dragon that King Gale slays, and not Eustace the dragon. But you can see the dragon is looking very miserable. That's what he might, because King Gale is about to stick him with a sword. So yeah, that's a marvelous illustration. As a student, I once shared a house with a boy whose parents lived close to Pauline Baines, and he had been given by her 6 of her pen and ink drawings, and they were framed on his walls. And I'm so jealous, so envious. But you know,
I remember, Catherine, one of the first things I did as a young journalist was to go and interview Pauline Baines for the Times, because I was so fascinated in her work. And I longed to ask if I might buy one of her drawings, and I was too shy and too in awe of her. She did give me a beautiful book there that she signed, and it's something I've regretted all my life, that I didn't pluck up the courage to do this, because she was so nice, terribly kind. She was married to a German ex-prisoner of war, so she had quite an interesting story to tell, which of course the Times never ran. Very sad, but truly interesting.
I never got up the courage. I mean, it never even occurred to me that I might write to C.S. Lewis. And I realise now that if I had done, he would have probably written back, because he was very good at that with children. But it never occurred to me, and teachers in those days didn't do this. Now, class, we're all going to pick your favourite writer and you can write a letter to them, which of course we all love when we get them.
Yes, well, some people love, some people absolutely hate it. There's a theory that the greatest children's authors all lose their parents young. I don't know if you've come across this, but it certainly does seem to be a recurring feature. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because you write so beautifully about Diggory in The Magician's Nephew, and how Lewis is trying to make the universe into a kinder place, but he can't quite.
Well, I think the thing that struck me most about rereading The Magician's Nephew and seeing what he does with Diggory, who is by no means always a pleasant boy. He is, I think I said somewhere in that chapter that in one way, the whole book is about how he stops being the magician's nephew, because it's quite clear that he could grow up to be just like his Uncle Andrew. And of course, he's this avatar of Lewis, and Lewis must have realised this. He even becomes the professor, just as Lewis did, although we never find out what the professor is a professor of. But Lewis is so much kinder to Diggory and Diggory's grief and desperation than he is to his own childhood self in Surprised by Joy. He's really quite hard on this little boy, as he was, criticising his prayers for his mother. And again, he says, I think I thought of God as a magician. And I think there's that connection with the book. And of course, in Lewis's view as an adult, regarding God as a magician who's going to pull out what you want like a rabbit from a hat and then disappear isn't the way to behave. And I suppose it's partly a book about how he converted, but I do think that all the tenderness and the poignancy of his situation as a little boy got poured into The Magician's Nephew and not into his own autobiography, which is, I'm not sure, I think it must have post-dated that, but yeah.
And it was the last Narnia book that he wrote, wasn't it? The Magician's Nephew, which is very interesting.
Do you know, I'd have to check, but you're probably right.
I think a wild
mixture of things being written and then put aside and started later and, you know, jumbled up. It's really confusing. I'd actually have to go and consult the chart, I think. But you're probably right. Yeah.
I think you say, I mean, you can see that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the first. It's got all sorts of sort of loose threads and things sticking out that as an adult reader you notice, whereas yes, I mean, even he gets better. I think we're starting to run out of time. I don't know if there's one more question that there have been lots of interesting ones in the chat box.
Yeah, there have been loads of great questions. I suppose there are three more. If we can probably squeeze them in, if that's okay. Catherine and Amanda. The first two, these kind of two sort of come together. They're sort of the theme would be things that work well and things that work less well in the Narnia Chronicles. Vineet asks about the appearance of Father Christmas in The Lion, the Witch and the War Drobe, which he says for him seemed a bit out of place, and asks, do you share that view? And Sybil Ruth asks, do you feel the pagan elements of Lewis's fiction work better than the Christian ones?
Good question.
Very good, yeah. Father Christmas I never actually minded, although I know a lot of people do find him very out of place. I think he's a product of the fact that Lewis came up with this marvellous phrase, always winter and never Christmas. And so you have to bring in Christmas somehow in order to show that I mean, he could have ditched the phrase, but let's face it, it's a gorgeous phrase. You know, he wasn't going to ditch that. It was one of those darlings you can't kill, always winter and never Christmas. And so to show that the White Witch's power is failing, who should come in but Father Christmas? But I think if you take Father Christmas as quite an ancient sort of spirit of the woods, which I did an essay about this on my blog over this Christmas, as a matter of fact, and I found to my interest that Father Christmas and Santa Claus have quite different origins. Father Christmas goes back to the 16th century at least, and appears in pageants, riding on a goat usually, and throwing out food to people around about Yule time. It used to be the Yule goat that he rode upon, whereas Santa Claus is basically an invention in America around about the time of the Civil War. So they've got different elements. And so I think if you've got an ancient old man who rides through the wood and distributes favours or not, as the case may be, it's getting rather close to Grandfather Frost in the Russian tales, who's the spirit of the cold. And there's a wonderful story in which a girl is sent out into the woods because her stepmother, of course, wants to get rid of her. And she's sent out to gather flowers in the winter time. And Grandfather Frost appears, and she's very polite to him and calls him grandfather, and so he wraps her in furs and sends her home with riches. And then, of course, the stepsister comes out and is rude to the Frost. I think she's got to say, "I'm beautifully warm, grandfather. I'm beautifully warm," which is a total lie. But she's been so polite that he treats her well. Whereas, of course, the wicked stepsister complains and says, "It's so cold. I'm pinched. I'm going to die," and effectively does. So you've got to be polite to interesting old men dressed in furs that you meet in the woods. And so for me, Father Christmas has that sort of vibe. He's got a kind of Gawain and the Green Knight feel about him as well. He's got a holly, he's got the holly berries on his head. And I think if you look at him as a sort of Yuletide figure, it works better. Yeah. So, and actually Tolkien did something equally egregious in The Hobbit, which I didn't like as a child, that book, although Amanda, I know you absolutely adore it. But the bit where, yes, it's a bit where Gandalf is explaining that the game of golf was invented when a goblin's head was knocked off by a club and sailed sort of 30 yards through the air and disappeared down a rabbit hole, and that's how the game of golf. Yeah. And I didn't like that because it seemed so consciously flippant. And I didn't like being talked down to, and it annoyed me. Whereas I quite like Father Christmas. But I think Lewis was very, very wise not to reintroduce him into the books. But I personally don't mind him. I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Yeah, so the second question was from Sybil Ruth. And do you feel the pagan elements of C.S. Lewis's fiction work better than the Christian ones? And she mentions particularly the death of Aslan on the stone table, which for her never worked as a child, even though which War Drobe.
Right, yeah, well, it did work for me. I was pretty upset by it. I was very upset by it, but not to the extent that I was weeping floods of tears, because I was fairly sure that this was the sort of book where things turned out all right. And in fact, back in the 1960s, most children's books did turn out all right, and there were happy endings. So my expectation of fiction was that if bad things happened, they would be temporary and something good would follow. But no, it did work for me. I think partly because of the reaction of the children. Lucy and Susan are so upset as they're watching, and I identified very strongly with Lucy and Susan, and their reactions became my reactions. But I think that the pagan elements are done very, very well. I love that bit in Prince Caspian where Lucy is walking through the woods. And if you remember the story, the Telmarines have sent or banished all the magical and natural creatures of Narnia are basically underground or in hiding. The Telmarines are trying to turn Narnia into a human world without magic. Caspian, as a little boy, is told not only that there is no such thing as Aslan, but there is no such thing as lions, which impressed me because I didn't have to roll the lions. But they come back, and of course Caspian meets the dwarfs and he meets the fauns, but he doesn't meet the trees. The trees are not awakened. So the natural world of Narnia is still asleep and only comes back to life when Aslan reappears in the world of Prince Caspian. But there's a marvellous moment when Lucy is walking through the woods in the moonlight and she feels as though she could almost bring them back to life. And the trees are, she remembers how they used to talk to her, and she remembers how they used to dance and move, and the trees themselves seem to be dancing. And she weaves her way between them to meet Aslan in a moonlit glade. And I think that's wonderful because the trees are almost awake and they're not. And they don't awake until the battle at the end, when they actually sort of arrive to aid King Peter and Prince Caspian when the Telmarine forces turn treacherous. So it's very much like the March of the Ents at that point, and I do wonder whether Lewis borrowed that from Tolkien. It might have given another thing.
I think they were constantly borrowing from each other, don't you? I mean, they were both medieval, steeped in medieval literature.
Well, I think he had this wonderful sense of in fact, there's a poem he wrote about a dryad, I think, which I've got this selected or collected poem somewhere, which I really liked. Out from your dim felicity of leaves, O nymph appear, answer me in soft showery voice, attempt the unrooted dance. And I think that's lovely. So, I mean, he wasn't a great poet, but I do like that. It swept me away when I was a child.
That sense, I think, of the beauty of the natural world and the almost sort of mystical power for good. I'm sure that is rooted in them both having come through the First World War. So many writers and indeed painters seem to be obsessed with trees and woods and green. And you think if you were just surrounded by mud and fire and machines, I mean, you can see where all that very, polarized worlds comes from, how deeply it would have affected their imagination. And I think it still speaks a lot to children now, because we see the natural world again, more and more under threat from, guess what, machines and buildings. Is there time for one last question before we?
Yeah, I think so. One last question, I think, and then we'll after I've asked this question and Catherine's answered it, maybe we'll all unmute ourselves and give Catherine a round of applause. But firstly, here's the question. It's from Hannah, and Catherine, it is: if you were able to ask C.S. Lewis a question directly about his books or his life, what would you ask?
Well, gosh, I think I might ask him what the next book was going to be. Really, I'd want to know what the next book was going to be, and yeah, he could go. He could do something. He could do something for us, I think. And I know Francis would think so. We won't get to that, but yeah. I don't know. I think that would happen with the question. I think that was the only question I really wanted to ask C.S. Lewis when I was a child, was what's the next book? Where does the next story come from? Yeah. I want to read more.
Yes.
Well,
we all want to read more.
yeah, absolutely. So I guess we've more or less reached conclusion. I just want to hold the book up one more time. From Spare Oom to War Drobe, it's available in hardback as an ebook from all good bookstores, and it's available now. If you want a signed copy, email me. The details are in the chat, but we'll email around how to do that on Monday as well. And the video of this, if you want to rewatch it, will go up again. Will go up on Monday on our YouTube channel. But thank you so much, Amanda, for interviewing Catherine. And Catherine, thank you so much for writing this really passionate and amazing book. And to finish, why don't we all unmute ourselves and give Katherine a round of applause, and then that will be.
Thank you all so much for
Thanks,
coming.
Katherine.
Thank you.
Well done, Katherine.
Thank you all.
Brilliant.
You're all so
Well done,
lovely.
Kath.
Thank you. And thank you particularly to Brian forward as well.
Yeah, well done, Catherine.
Yes.
Well, thanks all for coming, and have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Well done.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.